If you like audiobooks or audio shows, check out a free trial of Audible. Just click the link in the description.
Welcome to Mind Shock. This is a very important episode, critical for anybody interested in logic, reason, the state of the world, and the possible true origins of such problems. Bold claims, I know, but this is Mind Shock, and all the Mind Shock listeners out there know that we get into topics and theories that few others dare discuss. This is a podcast discussing the problem of assumed competence. This is, of course, related to the indoctrination into the cult of authority and state worship, as well as scientism and its connections to government. I've received many requests to address more issues with scientism and government worship and how that's problematic from a logical standpoint. Again, I'm not really political in the sense I don't really advocate political parties or political candidates of any kind. I don't jump to assumptions on any side of any issue, but I am for logical analysis and logically forming opinions and being able to deduce which variables are valid or responsible for certain issues, and not focusing on variables that can be ruled out or at least do not have a high probability of being related. And I will touch upon the George Floyd situation, the rioting in the U.S., and all these things. People have asked for analyses on this, logical analyses. I don't see too many people out there doing logical analyses. Most people are just jumping to one side or another, just playing right into the hands of the corrupt profiteers, the masters and controllers that exploit them without even realizing it. As always, if you enjoyed the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the bell for notifications. If you like the podcast, hit the like button, share it across social media platforms, promote logic, reason, and truth. You could check us out, Twitter, Reddit, Facebook, Patreon. Patrons do get a priority for topic or true crime case or logical analyses and co-podcaster requests. Questions, comments, thoughts, theories, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings, insults of any kind, leave them in the comments section. All right, so let me jump into the root issue here, the possible root issue. Again, I'm not claiming anything's definitive one way or another, other than to utilize logic and reason. That's really the only thing I advocate across the board. So I know obviously the trolls, those that are deficient in English comprehension, they have a lot of difficulty in understanding that. And as you can see through a lot of the comments, there's just nothing but fallacious attacks because they don't understand that. They strawman and pretend I am on a particular side of a particular issue, and it's all very bizarre. Is it accidental that these government education institutions or facilities, indoctrination facilities, ranging from elementary school all the way up through postgraduate institutions, where people receive a higher degree of indoctrination? Again, that doesn't mean that a lot of the things they're learning are false. That just means they are being indoctrinated. Very big distinction there. So, what is assumed competency, and how has it affected the world, both in modern times and ancient times? So, let's look at certain leading causes of death. So, of course, medical errors are anywhere between the first and third leading cause of death based on the admitted statistics by the American Medical Association, reported by NBC and various different news outlets on all sides of the political spectrum. So if medical errors are responsible for so many deaths, why is that? Is there an assumed competency, or even we can take the latest pandemic situation, is there an assumed competency that certain experts know what's best? See, for individuals indoctrinated into the occult of authority worship, they desperately look to others for answers and to take responsibility. Why would a free, responsible, competent individual look for definitive answers from others? That doesn't mean you don't learn from people. That doesn't mean you don't listen to their opinion and their theory and assess its logical validity Doesn't mean you don't do that. It doesn't mean you don't use these strict principles of validity to discern truth or possibility of truth. But to take on blind faith as gospel truth from one or two or a group of particular masters and controllers, whether you're talking about Democrats, Republicans, whoever you're talking about, whichever side of the political spectrum, whichever country you want to pick, all of these themes are kind of synonymous with at least first world countries. This just hopeless indoctrination into the occult of authority worship. Whatever the idiot box parrots, people take on blind faith as gospel truth. It's very, very bizarre. Now, I'm not stating that the entire George Floyd situation was a staged event, but even if it were a staged event, that doesn't mean that he didn't die or he wasn't murdered. That doesn't mean any of those things. That just means it might have been staged in a way to propagate particular rioting. Because there have been many other situations, even unfortunately, even worse than the Floyd situation. I mean, there's just countless cases of police officers killing an individual, even 5 or 10 police officers at once, acting as a gang of thugs, just stomping on unarmed individuals. And I will address the fact that race does not seem to be the variable. Now, I know a lot of people are going to get triggered by that. A lot of people are going to say that basically advocate for Black Lives Matter without advocating for all lives matter, completely ignoring that all lives matter in no way removes the acknowledgement of the suffering occurred by another group of people, like Black Lives Matter. However, Black Lives Matter doesn't specifically acknowledge the suffering of other minorities or Caucasians under police brutality. Now, anybody who's done any kind of statistics work obviously knows that police actually kill more white men than black men. Now, there's even been some just really silly arguments brought forth that theoretical lives matter more than actual lives. Now, this is really bizarre. I mean, we're delving into some psychosis and sociopathy here because the propaganda has been unleashed, obviously, against the masses of all skin colors, of all eye colors and hair colors, of all heights and weights, of all clothing brand preferences. I mean, you could use whatever variables you want. There are corrupt profiteers at the top of a pyramid, and then there is everyone else. In order for corrupt profiteers to maintain their power and exercise their control over the masses, it's much, much easier of a job to do when the masses are destroying each other, when they're fighting with each other, because then they're not united as one. So this is not unlike any conflict in history. You have the peasants, and then you have the rulers. When you get the peasants to fight among themselves for a bunch of arbitrarily selected variables, I mean, you could say all redheads are this, or redheads are mistreated by police. Look at how many police are killing redheads. So before people accuse me of being insensitive, of course, of which there are many, I'm not denying the prejudice that exists against every single group of people, including people who happen to have darker skin than other people. All humans are discriminated against in different ways. Now, I don't know why this is so hard for many people to understand, but no two black people have the same exact life. No two white people have the same exact life. They're going to meet different, varying degrees of prejudice for a million different reasons. Who they're friends with, what family they're associated with, what sports team they're rooting for. I mean, there are situations where rival sports fans are stomped to death. I mean, it's terrible. They were prejudiced. They were discriminated against the team because they're rooting for a different team. I mean, discrimination exists for so many different variables. To pretend one variable is more valid than another, that's really bizarre to me. And of course, true justice is blind. So anybody interested in real justice should be removing all modifiers, because then you're not getting blind justice. Because if murder is illegal, then it doesn't matter who you murder. It doesn't matter what their skin color is, what their eye color is, what their hair color is, how tall they are, how much they weigh, whether they prefer Nike or Reebok, whatever they were wearing. That's all irrelevant. If anybody who values life is going to value that life regardless of any of these variables. So I actually posted a Twitter challenge there, which obviously nobody has responded to yet. I don't know if there's that many logical people out there that use Twitter. I mean, maybe there are. I mean, Mindshock does have a number of followers on Twitter, so I guess there are some logical people out there. But here's an interesting logical exercise. If we're looking at numbers, so the people that are advocating for theoretical lives over actual lives lost, they're bringing forth statistics like you're more likely to be killed by a police officer if you're black. Is that true? So let's say it's true, but is it true because of the skin color or because of other variables that happen to be the skin color? For example, if a lot of people happen to be more people wear Nikes than Reeboks that are killed by police officers, if you're wearing Nike, you're more likely to be killed by a police officer. So that would be a true statement if you collected all the data. Now, would your death be as a result of Nike or Reebok discrimination? Or would that be a variable that was not the cause of your death? Is the true cause the incompetency of a police officer? Because if a police officer is incompetent, they're going to kill whoever's in front of them if they're not competent enough to use minimal force. Now, there's a lot of white people, more white people are being killed than black people. Now, the counter to that, of course, is that per capita, since blacks represent a smaller percentage of the population, that's why less of them are being killed. So that's also a bizarre claim because that doesn't account for infinite other variables. So there are certain things called controls in science. So if you're making a scientific, logical, fact-based argument as opposed to a logically fallacious emotional appeal engineered by propaganda to ensure the exploitation of the majority of a populace, black, white, all colors, green, whatever, this simply an emotional appeal propagandist position? I will postulate that it appears to be so, because let's look at this example. Obviously, police officers kill exponentially more men than women. That's a true statistic, right? So if you're a man, you're statistically exponentially more likely to be killed by a police officer. Now, are you more likely to be killed by a police officer because the police officer is sexist? Now, these are the logical questions. Any logical individual should have no problem answering these questions, but people that are just bereft of logic and reason, that are being exploited for the fact that they're just making these knee-jerk emotional reactions. Now, nobody's saying those reactions are unjustified in relation to the injustice. It's just the variable of skin color. According to all logic, reason, and science, that's not the variable. Similarly to gender. Is gender discrimination really the variable in why police officers kill more men than women? Let's say you're in a particular town that has a lot of incompetent police officers. Also, one other variable that's not considered, if these are racially motivated police brutality executions, why are a large percentage of the officers that shoot black men also black? So are they racist against, so they want to kill more blacks than whites? That doesn't make any sense. The only way to make sense of it is to use the totality of information available and to properly assess these variables. Let's say you're in a corrupt, incompetent jurisdiction, primarily white. According to the statistics of that town, you'd more likely be shot dead by the police if you were white rather than black, based on the numbers. I know that might not be true, because if there is a prejudicial officer, which of course there are, let's not fall for black and white fallacies, obviously there are some officers that probably would rather shoot a black person than a white person. However, if they're truly incompetent, the root cause is their incompetence. They're going to kill anybody when threatened. If they're that insecure and narcissistic, if they fear for their safety and returning home to their families more than more than they actually care about doing their job and upholding the law, they're going to kill anybody in front of them. Now, if their jurisdiction has a primarily black population, of course they're going to shoot more black people. An incompetent officer with a primarily white population, even if the officer is black himself, he's going to be shooting more white people than black people. Not because he's racist against white people, although, I mean, you might find some single digits that are, but I'm not alleging that. The same way that a black officer shooting primarily black people or a black officer shooting primarily white people is probably the racial motivation is probably not the skin color, the same way it's probably not the height or the weight or the sneaker preference. Just because the statistics show more people are killed wearing Nikes versus wearing Reeboks, that doesn't mean there was a prejudice against the sneaker brand. That just means the demographic involving these police encounters had those numbers at play. So whenever you're attributing motivations, of course, there's Hanlon's razor. Everybody knows about Occam's razor, even though they don't apply it accurately, but people just really don't give Hanlon's razor enough credit. Never attribute to malice what can easily be explained by stupidity. So again, I'm an advocate, of course, of true justice. If you don't follow my wrongful conviction podcasts, I do a number of podcasts in true crime cases where a lot of individuals, black, white, Asian, they have been railroaded. Their presumptions of innocence was violated, and it was not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that they were guilty. Obviously, there are many incompetent people in every single profession. And now I'm going to circle back around here. I'm going to circle back around to the main topic at hand here, which is assumed competence. Should we move to a system of assumed incompetence? Because when you have doctors killing so many people, again, these are the admitted medical mistakes. We're not even going to go into what was covered up. We're not going to go into the deaths caused by vaccines that are not reported. We're talking about either a doctor botching something, but also including using prescriptions as described. Let's say somebody's perfectly healthy, then they have headaches. Now, they don't have any other conditions, but the doctor prescribes a certain drug with side effects. The person takes the drug. One of the side effects is death. They die. Now, is that a competent doctor? Now, here's the issue. Because of the indoctrination into the cult of authority worship, how many doctors actually think from themselves, use logic and reason, critical thinking, just the ability to discern and deduce all these variables and information? Or do they simply trust what a higher authority tells them? Do they simply trust the instruction of upper hierarchy medical boards, medical institutions, government officials, the church of the CDC? What is going on here? Because if you remove this assumed competency, because how many people are truly competent at their job? I mean, really? Like, we could say pilots are probably pretty competent, right? Because how often does a plane get from point A to point B as intended? The majority of the time. I mean, if you actually calculate the percentages, pilots seem to be more competent than the average driver on the highway. Because the chance of dying on the highway is much higher than the chance of dying on a flight. So, circling back again to these people that are advocating for per capita lives matter more than actual lives, if so many more people, regardless of skin color, if they happen to be white, they're dying from police brutality, is the problem really racially motivated police brutality or police brutality? Because, again, improperly assessing variables to make these artificial manufactured risk factors of, again, if your risk is higher of being shot as a black man, if you're factoring in the large percentage of black police officers shooting black men, can we say that the racial motivation is behind this risk factor? Or similarly, if you happen to be wearing Nikes versus Reeboks or whatever the case may be, or if you're a man, there's some kind of sexist agenda being perpetrated by police forces specifically against men. Or are there other variables at play, and the other variables, like assumed competency, are responsible here, or the incompetency of police officers? Now, obviously, nobody is denying that there's a serious issue with abuse of power from top to bottom in first world countries. How often is justice served? The thing that's weird about all of these riots and everything, I think both sides agree that there are bad police officers and that there are good police officers, just like in any other profession. I mean, even in a profession such as regarding commercial airlines, The majority of pilots are competent, but there's a couple of pilots, they drink on the job, they get found out, they get fired. Some of them might not get found out. Some of them might be recreational drug users. I know they get tested at certain intervals. Some of them know how to beat the test, whatnot. Some of them aren't very good. Some of them get distracted easily. Some of them crash planes. There are some. Nobody's alleging it's the majority. It's a vast minority. With police officers, it's a little bit more difficult because the training for police officers does not seem to be done well, because so many police officers seem to be incompetent. They're specifically trained to be able to handle life and death situations using minimal force without violating the rights of the citizens. Clearly, there are issues here. When certain individuals put on a costume, they think they are exempt from authority or the law. Certain prosecutors and judges believe the same thing. There's definitely this kind of culture of abuse of power. Does it have anything to do with race? I don't think so. Does it have anything to do with sexism? I don't think so. Does it have anything to do with brand preference on sneakers? I don't think so. If someone can provide actual objective data in line with the scientific method that simply not appeals to emotions or the propaganda of corrupt profiteers seeking to exploit the masses of all skin colors, of all heights and weights and eye colors and hair colors and sneaker brand preferences. So these are, of course, very, very important issues. And if there wasn't this assumed competency, like people assume politicians are competent, can people name a politician who's competent? Now, you could say that two different ways. If the goal of the politician is to be corrupt and exploit the populace and just be a criminal, then you could say that most politicians are competent. But if you're using the definition as to someone who propagates the public good, not masquerades as doing what's best for the public while extorting them and lining their own pockets and destroying the civilization that they're attempting to help, because look at the past 100 years. What are the patterns here? Some people believe government just proposes really terrible solutions to the problems government caused in the first place, causing a spiral that causes the decline of all civilizations. So is this cult of authority worship where people basically have these delusions that other people are experts and should know what's best for them, and they're willing to be subjugated, exploited, and extorted because of this indoctrination into the cult of authority worship? Let me touch upon scientism and its connection to the government. So you have obviously these tax scams like global warming. Obviously, nobody's denying the climate cycles of the earth. Obviously, it's a big propagandized field. If you follow the money, you will see the amount of money being dumped into studies showing a link between man-caused pollution and climate change, whereas the money is not there for the opposite. Why? Because of carbon taxes. Again, this has nothing to do with whether or not humans are impacting the environment or not, but if you follow the money, you'll see the corruption that exists behind it. Now, the coincidence theorists, the reality deniers, for whatever reason, they don't believe that people could either be mistaken or corrupt. I don't know why. It's, again, due to this indoctrination as the cult of authority worship and this complete refusal or inability to use logic and reason. So once again, we circle back to this assumed competency. Now, it's not even logically consistent, because if you take someone who believes in man-made climate change and not only believes in it, but believes that it's so significant that New York City would be underwater by the year 2000, like some of these leading climate change lobbyists, obviously their predictions are, I don't know what, they were like 90% wrong or something like that over the past few decades. But for whatever reason, they maintain the propaganda and they get a lot of people to rally behind them. What is this assumed competence? Because it's kind of hypocritical, because depending on the faith-based belief systems of the indoctrinated illogical coincidence theorists, the masses, the lemmings, they're going to choose based on their faith and propaganda to put their faith and assume competence in one group of experts but not another. So that doesn't even make any sense in the first place. But that does illustrate how the logical fallacy of appeal to authority is very critical. You can make the case, again, a priest is an authority. They can speak to God, you can't, so you have to trust their word. Obviously, everybody realizes how silly that is, but ironically, they don't realize it's the same silliness when they hang on the word of corrupt politicians or scientists executing political agendas. It's the same deal. That's why logic and reason, true logic and reason, are objective, not subjective. Real science doesn't pick sides. Real science doesn't speak. Real science is a tool like a hammer. It can be wielded correctly or incorrectly, competently or incompetently. And of course, the differences between science and scientism, which is, of course, the religion built upon this authority worship that sees criticism as conspiracy and blasphemy, that seeks to silence and censor any dissenting opinion except other than welcoming it. Because real science or real scientists would be not only be open to, but would welcome all of this criticism. They wouldn't see it as blasphemy or conspiracy or try to shut it down. So, or call it settled science. Anybody that uses the term settled science is an obvious priest of scientism, because science by definition is never settled. It's questioning the universe objectively, not desperately, dogmatically, religiously, and based on faith clinging to a particular side or theory, completely ignoring other variables. So how does this assumed competency manifest throughout the ages? So was there this level of assumed competency, let's say 50 years ago, 100 years ago, or did people take more personal responsibility? Regarding to your own health, should you take your own health seriously and take responsibility for your health, or should you cry for the nanny state to take care of you? Now, again, I'm not saying one is wrong or right or that there's no place for it, but these are just the important logical questions to ask. Should one constantly put their faith and put this assumed competency into so-called experts? Or should a certain amount of time be dedicated to learning logic and reason, basic English comprehension, psychology, so that the masses can realize their own Dunning-Kruger? Dunning-Kruger is a very real thing. Most people are too incompetent to understand their own incompetence. Anyone who admits to knowing anything for sure, or throws around 100% this, 1000% this, they're very ignorant of other variables. Now, they could be right or they could be wrong, but if they're not allowing themselves to be wrong, clearly they're not understanding their own incompetence, because there's always infinite unknown variables. Now, do they mean someone is wrong or right? Obviously not. But to ignore them, to ignore the possibility that you might be wrong about something, that is definitely an extreme sign of Dunning-Kruger. Now, obviously on Mind Shock, the motto is, the only thing we know for sure is that we don't know anything for sure. And I'm not even sure about that. So exploring all these things with not just an open mind, but the correct definition of words, I would say that's a certain base layer of competency. So I think the average individual, if they get their ego in check, they can verify the definitions of words and move forward. Because a lot of people calling all these people racist, they don't even realize they're the ones being racist by doing that, because they don't even know the definition of racism or prejudice. So, and similarly, a lot of people talking about economic systems like capitalism or socialism, they don't even know the definitions, so they're making all of these emotional appeals and arguments, just stacking these fallacies off definitions that aren't even true. So this kind of spirals out of control, and does this all come back to assumed competency and the cult of authority worship? Because when you believe these talking heads on TV can't be wrong, that they are these infallible priests that should just be trusted, their words should be taken on blind faith as gospel truth. Now, whether you have that attitude towards police, prosecutors, judges, presidents, mayors, governors, why would you have that attitude towards anyone? If you're a logical, scientifically minded individual who can think clearly, who has not had logic and reason indoctrinated out of them by this propaganda machine run by these corrupt profiteers, and I'm not even getting into any kind of Illuminati conspiracy theories. Let's not even go there. I mean, even though this is my jack, I know a lot of people, they want to go down all those different rabbit holes, but you don't even have to. A lot of people that are attracted to these positions of power, They're these narcissistic sociopaths and psychopaths. That's obvious to see. I mean, how many honest politicians are there? Perhaps there's a justification for the cliche. So would an honest person want to be a politician? And yes, you could say there are certain amounts, but how many of them would remain honest? Once you're thrust into a dishonest, corrupt system, you're a cog in the machine. Even if you were honest when you began, you're kind of overwhelmed by the corruption and incompetence. And that's assuming you were non-corrupt, non-incompetent in the first place. So what is the rate of competency among the general population? I don't know. I mean, obviously it's a sliding scale. Obviously it's a spectrum. I mean, how many people have complaints about contractors when they're doing a remodel or a house build? How many times do things go wrong? How many times do they go perfectly? So, I mean, it comes down to a threshold of acceptability. Now, the last point I'm going to make is, of course, I'm just going to touch upon gun control here. Again, not to get political. I believe the Constitution is clear. I'm not necessarily for or against. I'm also not in the business of telling other people what to do, nor do I believe people have the right to tell other people how to live. However, your personal safety is your responsibility. So there's an old saying, of course, when seconds matter, police are minutes away. So people fearing for the safety of their own lives and their family, are they going to wait the minutes for police to come when there are rioters, tearing down their house and throwing bombs in their windows, or soldiers from another country, or whoever? I mean, that's the whole point. Unpredictable threats. And to just have this blind faith and assumed competency in every single police department, in every single jurisdiction, and that they're going to 100% be able to save your life in time, and that justifies making guns illegal for people when criminals don't follow laws, that's really bizarre. Also, an important point to note with the police shootings, of course, if you're in a city that has outlawed guns, you're going to have a gun problem, because then only the criminals have guns, and they know that the citizens are going to be unarmed. So if you also look at these supposedly racially motivated police shootings of black men, these occur in high crime areas where there's a lot of gun restrictions. So what does that mean? Obviously, it has nothing to do with their skin color, just the same way it has nothing to do with their sneaker brand preference, or that it could be a man versus a woman. They just happen to be living in a city where there are these very strict gun regulations, so there are more criminals that own guns. Does it have anything to do with skin color, eye color, hair color, height, weight, gender, or sneaker brand preference? The numbers can show a disproportionate amount in one versus the other. Does that prove there's a discrimination, or does it prove there's a competency issue with the officer? Now, again, this is, of course, for the unjustified shootings. When someone is attempting to kill the officer, I think every human being has the right to defend themselves. Costume or no costume, in certain cases, it could have been a justified defense. However, we all know that there are a certain amount of corrupt officers out there that will put weapons in the hands of the deceased to make it appear that they had a weapon, even if they didn't. Again, that is covering up competency. So let's go back to the gun issue for a moment. So these are statistics for concealed carry, FBI crime stats. An analysis of FBI crime statistics found that states that adopted concealed carries laws reduced murders by 80.5%, rapes by 5%, aggravated assaults by 7%, robberies by 3%. With just one exception, every public mass shooting in the U.S. since 1950 has taken place where citizens are banned from carrying guns. Despite strict gun restrictions, Europe has had 3 of the worst 6 school shootings. This is from a number of years ago. I don't know how accurate that is now. So let's look at the statistics. Of course, I mean, that's just a common sense thing. A criminal would, of course, want to go to a gun-free zone because they're going to be unopposed as they attempt to create violence. The people saying they don't want everybody carrying guns all over the place, you wouldn't want someone to save your life in the seconds that matter before the police get there several minutes later. I mean, that's a little bizarre, but let's examine the competency versus police versus armed citizens. So, I don't know the exact year of this study. This seems to be I don't know, it might be about 10 years old or so. 794,300 police officers in the US. 80 million gun-owning citizens. So the police have an 11% error rate for 794,300 officers. 80 million gun-owning citizens have a 2% error rate. There were an average amount of deaths of a shooting rampage stopped by police included 14.3 deaths. There were 2.3 average deaths of a shooting rampage stopped by a citizen. The police killed 606 criminals each year, averaged. 1,527 criminals are killed each year by armed citizens. So, of course, the lack of critical thought and logic by people that want to just ban all guns, not that they don't have good intentions, but just this belief in this unicorn fairy tale world where criminals would abide by that. Obviously, they wouldn't. So, everyone points to the deaths caused by guns, but nobody looks at the deaths saved by guns. So depending on which studies you look at, you're talking upwards of 5 million lives saved every year. So how many more people would be dead if it weren't for armed citizens? And it's impossible to calculate because the number could be much, much higher, because how many criminals are deterred by an individual who's either open carrying or they suspect might have a gun? Because criminals usually, most criminals, I mean, you could attack me for this, most criminals looking to initiate violence against peaceful people are cowardly. And they're going to look for unarmed people and gun-free zones. So look at this competency rate. This competency rate is really bizarre. I mean, this is going to be an anecdotal logical fallacy, but just let's look at it for a moment. In 1982, Kennesaw, Georgia, passed a law requiring heads of household to keep at least one firearm in the house. The residential burglary rate subsequently dropped 89% in Kennesaw, compared to just a 10.4% drop in Georgia as a whole. So that's an important variable. People point to, let's say, Australia with their gun control, reduced crime. There's actually, depending on which statistics you look at, it might have actually slowed the reduction, because Australia already was having a drastic reduction in crime before gun control measures. And again, depending on which statistics you look at, the gun control measures could have potentially slowed the downward trend. So it was still a downward trend, and then this cherry-picking logical fallacy, compositional logical fallacy of taking a snapshot and claiming it was the gun reduction, it was the gun control that caused the reduction, without zooming out and looking at the bigger picture. I mean, people advocating for the efficacy of do that all the time. They zoom in on that on a small period of time after a was introduced, without looking at the grand picture, which already showed anywhere between an 80 and 98% reduction due to clean drinking water, better sanitation, better nutrition, coming on the tail of the industrial era. They completely ignore all these other variables. Now, again, I'm not claiming one is true or untrue, but you have to account for variables. So if there's a 10% normal crime drop, but there's an 89% drop in Kennesaw requiring each household to have at least one firearm. So 89 minus 10 is 79. So you could actually say that there was roughly a 79% drop in town only because of that ordinance, because you can make the claim that there was a 10% drop across Georgia no matter what. So these cowardly criminals were too scared to burglarize homes because they knew for a fact that there were gun owners in those homes. I have not seen any logical rebuttal for this. Again, a fairy tale unicorn world where there were no guns and criminals followed laws, that'd be nice, wouldn't it? But again, there's so much assumed competency here. So let me review those concealed carry statistics again. There's an 11% error rate across 794,300 officers. There's a 2% error rate among 80 million gun-owning citizens. Again, these stats are roughly about 10 years old. The average deaths of a shooting stopped by a police rampage, 14.3. The average deaths of a shooting rampage stopped by a citizen, 2.3. The average amount of criminals killed by police, 606. And again, that might be a deceptive number because a lot of those people might not have been real criminals. They were just classified as criminals. 1,527 criminals killed each year by armed citizens. And again, that might have a certain percentage difference either. So armed citizens are killing more criminals, so saving more lives than police officers. Again, I mean, it's just really bizarre to just really step back and take an objective, logical look, like remove all emotion and just look at the cold, hard facts and use cold, hard logic. What do we see here? And again, this was not meant to be any kind of political podcast. It's just a logical analysis of criminal issues, racial issues, how to identify responsible variables in line with the scientific method. That's why logic and reason is so important. And using logical fallacies to justify a position, even if the position happens to be a better position than another position, it's still fallacious. Logic is all about validity. What arguments are valid or invalid, and what are the true variables here? So, again, just very interesting numbers here. So, is this assumed competence the root cause of all these problems? This indoctrination into the cult of authority worship. If someone's wearing a costume of a certain kind, that doesn't mean they're in the right. If someone is specifically supposed to uphold the law, that doesn't mean they know the law or are capable of upholding the law. Police officers are supposed to be peace officers. In all these riots, the only time the officers are justified in using violence is when violence is brought upon them. I think most moral individuals agree to the non-aggression principle, non-violence. Once someone has initiated violence against you, they've given up their right to be free from violence themselves because they now are infringing on other people's right to be free and to be safe and their life, liberty, and their pursuit of happiness, which of course you can't pursue happiness if you're dead. So there's a lot of issues here. Obviously, Mindshock covers true crime and wrongful convictions. True justice is of course blind. The more people are hoodwinked by these manufactured propagandist points to divide and conquer, the more the totality of a population is divided and exploited. So to arbitrarily focus on skin color or eye color or hair color or gender or preference of sneaker brands, that doesn't address the real issue and the real problem. I am postulating, for the purpose of this podcast, that assumed competence and an indoctrination into the cult of authority worship and scientism is the main factor here. Too many people do not know how to utilize logic and reason. And I've actually been requested to go over logical exercises and logical fallacies independently, just so more people can logically examine a variety of topics, anything from the paranormal to true crime cases, as I do. So I will be doing that. But I hope all the listeners out there found this informative, and I hope everybody out there is staying safe. If you like the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell for notifications. Otherwise, you won't get the notifications. If you like this podcast, hit the like button. Share it across social media platforms. Questions, comments, thoughts, theories, rebuttals, debunkings, leave them in the comment section. And you can check us out on Twitter, Reddit, Facebook, Patreon. Patrons do get priority for case topic co-podcaster requests. This is Bruce McGuire signing off. Catch you guys next time.